Can we just be clear? There are some people who are warning against no deal, but saying it might happen. You are in a category of people who actively think that no deal could and would be a good idea. Is that right?
Well, first of all, we've heard an extremely jaundiced view from so-called full fact about what leaving on WTO terms would mean.
Forgive me, you shouldn't blame them. It is the BBC you should blame. It's a BBC correspondent, not full fact.
Yes, no, I appreciate that, but quite right. Okay, apologies. But most of the trade we do with the United States is on WTO terms, and it's our biggest single export market. And yes, we have side agreements on other things, but they're not the material factor. And most countries that trade on WTO terms have actually increased their trade with the European Union faster than we have during our period of membership. So that WTO terms is not the great impediment. Secondly, I mean, all these things about sandwiches and lettuces, I mean, what will happen to the quarter of Dutch poultry farmers who sell their goods to the UK, or the 1/5 of Spanish tomatoes that come to the UK? What will happen to those producers if the EU insists on putting up all these barriers? I mean, they would be rioting in the streets at this perverse behaviour.
But just spell out what would happen so that we don't rerun the argument. Forgive me 2 seconds. So we don't rerun the arguments about the referendum, which was about cheese and cars and so on. What are you saying would actually happen the day after we left the EU, but without any withdrawal agreement, whether by design or by mistake?
I'll answer that question directly. First of all, under the EU Withdrawal Act, we have imported all the EU's regulatory standards. So every product on sale in the UK market, every product made in the UK market, conforms with EU standards. And we can informally assure the EU that that will continue for as long as is necessary. And therefore, they do not need to put in religious zealotry checking at the borders of everything leaving the United Kingdom, madmen with clipboards. I mean, that is not how customs... I mean, that would be the EU imposing the most draconian customs checks, which is seen nowhere else, anywhere in this world.
But you're just gambling, aren't you, that they won't do this? Forgive me, let me just ask the question, give you a chance to answer. This is effectively a bet, a gamble. What you're saying, aren't you, is, look, Spanish tomato farmers won't put up with it, Dutch farmers won't put up with it, they don't need to do it. You don't know, I don't know, they might do what you don't think is in their logical best interests.
Well, we've had all this before, and it is the fear campaign, because, of course, in the end, people are rational economic actors, and they will not want to put their own producers out of business. They will not want to impoverish their own farmers and their own food producers. And least of all, I mean, take drugs, for example, this absurd idea that first of all, we export more drugs to the European Union than they export to us. So you imagine that they would want to maintain their supplies of drugs from us, not gum up the ports with slow and unnecessary and possibly illegal customs checks. But secondly, our drugs regime will automatically be in complete conformity with the EU drugs regime. There will be no new drugs on the market from day one.
Here's the difficulty for listeners, I think, and see if you can help us with this.
Well, I think it's a difficulty for the BBC. I think most people get this.
I'm going to give you a chance. I'm going to give you a chance to make exactly that point, but let me just ask the question. So you say we have our reality check correspondent on. Now, what does he do before you attack the BBC? He goes to talk to the food companies about what they're doing. He talks to the pharmaceutical companies about what they're doing. So you come on air and you say, ignore the Governor of Bank of England, he doesn't know anything. Ignore the boss of the food companies, they don't know anything. Ignore the pharmaceutical companies, they don't know anything. Ignore the manufacturers. Why should listeners believe you, a backbench politician, compared with ministers, businessmen and the Governor of the Bank of England? It's a reasonable question.
Well, I mean, read the website of Economists for Free Trade, who have done the proper analysis on this. Listen to Willie Walsh, the head of British Airways, who now assures us that the planes will fly, because he knows that all this talk actually is damaging business confidence, and it's extremely unrealistic to plan on this basis. I mean, I'm all for looking at worst-case scenarios. Actually, talking about worst-case scenarios usually means that they don't occur. But we should. The problem we've got is the industry. I mean, take Bombardier, who suddenly announced it's going to cost them 30 million to do customs checks. Have you worked out that even if every employee doing customs checks cost £100,000, that would be an extra 300 people just filling in customs checks.
Okay.
I mean, this is a ludicrous way of looking at the future.
So we shouldn't be
customs checks are becoming more and more automated.
So Bernard Jenkin?
But what's happening is the civil service and the government are feeding the industry, and the industry is feeding the government with this diet of gloom and alarm and despondency. Actually, it's unnecessary, and we will look back and wonder what all the fuss was about. A bit like the millennium bug. Remember all the experts on the millennium bug?
So Bernard Jenkin, thank you very much for joining us. As I said before,